Quite a dramatic weekend, of course. The rugby was just icing for what was not exactly nail-biting, and perhaps no real surprises in what happened, but a definitive change of mind from the New Zealand voting public, particularly compared to the last election. Joining us on the program now, political commentator and director of Democracy Project, Dr. Bryce Edwards. Bryce, kia ora, good morning, thanks for your time.
Morena, Andrew.
Now, perhaps no surprises, but any surprises for you in particular? I mean, there were some things which were like, oh gosh, didn't see that happening.
Well, that Labor defeat was as bad as we were talking about in previous weeks, but it was some of the electorates that Labor dropped, especially in Auckland, that really did stun me. Mount Roskill, some of those West Auckland seats, like New Lynn, almost losing Mount Albert.
And that's still
quite incredible.
There's still a bit to play for in Mount Albert. I mean, it looks likely that Labor will hold it, but this was former Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's seat and Helen Clark before her.
And Michael Joseph Savage before that. You know, this is a seat that Labor had held, you know, clearly and confidently for 77 years. It looked like they were actually going to lose it on election night. At the end of the night, it was held by Helen White by 103 votes. I think she'll probably hold it after the specials come in, but nonetheless, I think it also gives a nice kind of symbolic sense of the fact that, Labor are in trouble at the moment. And the candidate, Helen White, was made things worse in the media yesterday by, pushing back on the fact that this idea that the media suggesting that it hadn't been a great result for her. And she said, well, it has, no, I won it, and it's really just those pesky Greens that were standing against me that caused this problem.
It was like watching an embarrassing aunt, really. But hey, she did better in this than she did in the previous election, but we won't get into rehashing the past. It was a good election for the Greens with some extra, an increase in the party vote, but increased electorates. Wellington's starting to look a bit greener now.
Yeah, so I live in Wellington Central, and I wasn't going to be surprised if the seat went to any of the three leading candidates. What's a three-way split between Labor, National, and the Greens. So I wasn't surprised that Tamitha Paul won. She has been a very dynamic candidate. I saw her in some of the debates and thought, wow, she's really impressive in the way that she, communicates and is dynamic. But to see her win by the margin she did was totally surprising to me. She won it quite conclusively. And then in Rongotai for Julianne Genter to win that off, again, another Labor seat, totally red ribbon seat, to go green again is quite hurtful, I think, for Labor. So not only did they lose, votes to the right, they lost votes to the left. They were squeezed between, green and blue.
And hey, honestly, not only Auckland is perhaps pushing back after extended lockdowns, but even Wellington's sick of the Labor government. A bit of an indictment there. Some of the causal factors, do you think?
Oh, look, I think you're right to identify the COVID factor, and we saw that. It's a bit of a consensus now that, and it wasn't really that much in the public domain until recently, just how much Auckland are still holding that grudge about that lockdown going on so long. But that's a big factor. I mean, you also have to take into account in Auckland that some of those demographics have changed.
Yes.
And, seats like Te Aratu and New Lynn and Mount Roskill have a lot more immigrants in them than they used to. And Labor hasn't done a very good job of, embracing some of the, especially Asian immigration into the party. And National's done a better job, quite frankly. So I think Labor does need to do a lot of soul searching about, what it stands for, how it can be a bit more inclusive. This was a vote against Labor. I'm still not really convinced, even though we do have a definitive, we're going to have a definitive Chris Luxon National-led government. I still think it's the old maxim that governments lose elections oppositions don't win them.
Yeah.
Yes, they got what looks like 39% of the vote national, but I don't know, not getting to 40% isn't that impressive. And it's about what their average support has been across under MMP, even in their losing elections.
Yep.
So national, yeah, and when the votes first started to be reported on election night, they were looking to be 41, 42%, and that was shocking. I was amazed at that. But no, it came back down to something more like you would have expected.
And for ACT, not as good as an election night as they expected. Yes, picking up another seat, which gets complicated for some of the coalition negotiations, perhaps, but perhaps certainly not as good as they were expecting.
Yeah, well, I still haven't seen any great explanations for this. David Seymour perhaps bit off a bit more than he could chew during the campaign. He was a bit more aggressive to national than I think a lot of those early voters or the early support that had gone to ACT were comfortable with.
Yep.
So some of that support, I think, went back to national, thinking that maybe David Seymour's going to be a bit of a pain in a coalition and not be as stable as people on the right would like. But ACT still went up. They've still got more MPs than they had last Parliament.
And New Zealand First, as predicted, of course, got over the line. One of the things that surprised me on election night is it seemed that the commentators were saying, oh gosh, it's National and ACT, they'll be able to govern together, they won't need New Zealand First. And even though the numbers changed as we got closer to midnight, the rhetoric didn't. I mean, with respect to political commentators, they can't do their maths, it would seem.
No, look, I was shocked by this too, especially on Sunday when people kept on going with this idea that it was a National ACT government. And yes, they might have the barest of margins, even if the special votes that come in on the 3rd of November don't change anything, but they will. National and ACT cannot govern convincingly. They do need New Zealand First. And so those coalition negotiations are starting pretty much today, really. Winston Peters is flying into Wellington this morning. They'll start talking with National. As everyone knows, Winston Peters likes to wait until those final votes are in, and we know the exact makeup of the Parliament before making any decisions.
And honestly, it is close enough that even David Seymour's saying, hey, look, let's hold our horses on this one until the specials get in. It's going to be early November until we know the exact numbers and how much Winston Peters is required.
Yeah, but I think they will start having discussions before then. And there's really no reason they can't. Yes, Winston Peters can wait to signing off anything until he knows the exact leverage he might have. But all of those three parties know that they know the gist of the makeup of the next government. And they can start negotiating on that. But it's going to be a very difficult negotiations to try and fit all those three parties. And we don't really know yet whether National wants to have either of those minor parties actually in cabinet or having ministerial roles. And we don't know if ACT and New Zealand First want that either. So it's quite a mystery at this stage. So don't be surprised if it actually ends up being a National New Zealand First coalition government with ACT sitting on the crossbenches, giving them confidence and supplied, or vice versa. But it's going to be quite hard for ACT and New Zealand First to work together. So whether they'll be ministerial colleagues or not, is yet to be seen.
Yeah, no, it will be an interesting conversation. What's your thoughts on the specials? Now, traditionally they have gone left, of course, but will they go that way because they have historically, or will they go the way of the general tide, do you think?
They tend to be made up of people who are students, young people throughout New Zealand that aren't in their own electorates on voting day, or they haven't enrolled in time, so they need to do a late enrolment. There's a few overseas votes as well. I think they will tend to favour Labour and the Greens, maybe not as much as in previous years. So, I mean, Chris Bishop has already said that he expects National will lose a seat or two. I think that's that's probably pretty straightforward. Yeah.
Yeah. On to, I suppose, the future of the Labour Party, or what's left of it. Look, things come and go. We've seen these cycles beforehand, but I suppose one thing that came to mind as we're watching the results unfold is there space in the political spectrum for the current incarnation of the Labour Party, or have they been squeezed from the left and the right, and there's just not a governable majority or even an electable mandate for them with the leftovers?
So are you asking, Andrew, whether they will always exist, or whether they
Okay, I mean, that would be worst case scenario, but I suppose having to really go back and say, hey, what did we get wrong? Because it was pulled in two different directions, or squeezed from both sides, as it were. What will be the core identifiable factors of future Labour parties if they want to be a future Labour government?
Yeah, look, those are great questions, and there is a bit of an identity crisis in Labour at the moment. And yes, they are pulled off towards the Greens and to the centre and all sorts of things. And I think they do risk falling between, through the crack of having maybe a more real left-wing party, maybe in the Greens. And there's New Zealand First and there's National. And you're right, unless they have an identifiable brand, they have to go forward with that. I mean, my own feeling is that they probably need to go back to being a bit more of a working class party, representing working class voters, ordinary people, and leave the Greens to be the more sort of, I don't know, intellectual and social liberal party. But I don't know. It's going to be very difficult because obviously they've lost a lot of their MPs. They're pretty demoralised. They'll probably go into a bit of factional fighting, and fights over the leadership, frankly, could be difficult as well. So,
Chris Hipkins hanging on. Do you think that was wise?
Well, I've got no doubt that he won't be the leader taking Labour into the 2026 election. He's too discredited. But maybe he's right to hold on for a few months as a bit of a caretaker leader. But eventually that will have to change. And I'm thinking someone like Carmel Sepuloni, David Parker might be the better leader. I personally think David Parker would be their best bet. And he's kind of coming forward now as sort of the beacon for the left of the party, because he wants to have more tax reform, sort of bigger, bolder transformation than what Labour have done over the last 6 years. Yeah, no,
certainly it is all up from here for the Labour Party. Appreciate your comments and your insights, Bryce. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Andrew.